We live in a culture terrified of being unseen. We document our days to prove we exist, to prove we belong, to prove we are happy. But there is a silent, creeping exhaustion that comes from turning our actual lives into a daily, highly curated performance. Think about the last time we tried to capture a perfect, peaceful moment. We finally go on a weekend trip to unplug and escape the noise. Yet, we find ourselves slightly adjusting our coffee cup on the table. We wait for the perfect morning light, trying to carefully frame the exact feeling of relaxation. But in that precise fraction of a second when we lift the camera, the peace completely evaporates. We have split our minds in two. One half is desperately trying to live the experience. The other half is actively directing it, managing it, and preparing it for an invisible audience. It happens so gradually we barely notice the shift. A quiet walk in the park, a dinner with someone we love, a personal milestone. Everything subtly transitions from something we simply experience to something we present. We begin to view our own lives from the outside in. We stop asking, "How does this feel to me?" Instead, we ask, "How will this look to them?" There is a quiet, humming anxiety built into this documented life. It is the constant pressure to prove our weekends are fulfilling, our minds are healthy, and our lives are keeping pace. We build these digital avatars hoping to feel connected, yet the more time we spend maintaining them, the more profoundly empty we feel inside. It requires an exhausting amount of mental energy to constantly monitor our own existence, but recently, a quiet rebellion has started to emerge. Some of us just stop. We stop posting. We stop updating. We choose to exist entirely in the messy, private, undocumented margins of reality. Not because we have nothing to share, but because we want our lives to belong to us again. But in a world that equates visibility with worth, this kind of deliberate silence makes people deeply uncomfortable. If we refuse to be seen, society immediately begins to whisper that something must be terribly wrong with us. When we suddenly stop showing up on the digital stage, the world is quick to write a story for us. And usually, it is not a kind one. In a society that equates posting with thriving, silence is immediately interpreted as a symptom. People assume we must be deeply insecure. They think we are hiding because we aren't happy with how our lives look, or perhaps how our bodies look. They assume we are lonely, isolated, or quietly slipping into depression. Because why else would anyone voluntarily give up the social currency of attention? And the hardest part is that after hearing these assumptions enough times, we begin to believe them ourselves. We start to internalize the judgment. We look at our friends effortlessly uploading their weekends, smiling into their front-facing cameras with zero hesitation. And we wonder, why does this feel so impossibly heavy for me? We start carrying a hidden layer of shame. We label ourselves as complicated, overly sensitive, or just fundamentally broken. We tell ourselves we are just overthinking it, that we should just be normal and play the game. So sometimes we try to mask that discomfort. We take the photo, we edit the lighting, we write the caption. We sit there staring at the screen, our finger hovering over the share button. But right before we press it, a strange, overwhelming wave of resistance washes over us. Our chest tightens, and a sudden feeling of dread or exhaustion creeps in. And quietly, we delete the draft, feeling ridiculous that something so trivial could cause such internal chaos. We bury this struggle because it feels too embarrassing to admit out loud. How do we explain to someone that the simple act of being perceived online feels like a physical weight? How do we explain that maintaining a digital version of ourselves feels less like connection and more like carrying an incredibly heavy, invisible backpack every single day? It is an incredibly lonely place to be, to want to be part of the modern world, to want to share our joy, but to feel a visceral rejection of the very system required to do so. We spend years thinking this resistance is a character flaw. We assume our inability to casually broadcast our lives means we are weak, or that we simply lack the confidence everyone else seems to have. We let society convince us that our desire for privacy is actually just fear in disguise. But what if society is completely wrong? What if this quiet withdrawal has absolutely nothing to do with insecurity, low self-esteem, or weakness? What if, when we look beneath the surface, we find that this silence is actually a highly intelligent biological response? Because the moment we stop looking at this through the lens of social judgment and start looking at it through the lens of the human nervous system, everything changes. Let's pause and ask ourselves a different set of questions. When we hold our phones, hesitating to share a quiet moment from our lives, what is actually happening inside our bodies? Why does the simple thought of being perceived by hundreds of distant acquaintances suddenly trigger a very real fight-or-flight response? And what is our nervous system so desperately trying to protect us from? For years, society has told us that human beings are wired to seek attention and tribal validation. But as we dig into the neuroscience of how our minds process modern visibility, a completely different picture emerges. It turns out, the human brain was never designed to be constantly watched, consumed, and judged by a limitless audience. And for some of us, our nervous systems have simply recognized a profound, invisible threat that the rest of the world is still blindly accepting. To understand why stepping back can feel so incredibly liberating, we have to look at the heavy biological toll that constant performance demands. Because the reason we pull away has absolutely nothing to do with weakness. It has everything to do with how the brain preserves who we really are. To understand what is happening inside us, we have to look at how the brain processes visibility. For thousands of years, being seen and understood by our small, tight-knit tribe meant safety and survival. But today, our brains are attempting something they were never biologically designed to do. Imagine the human mind as a small, carefully managed broadcast control room. It was built to handle a few local signals, our close friends, our family, the people right in front of us. But modern social media forces us to run a 24-hour global television network out of that exact same tiny room. Suddenly, we are the director, the lead actor, and the anxious critic of our own lives. Every time we curate a moment for the internet, our brain has to actively build and sustain a secondary version of us. Neurologically, this requires a massive amount of continuous energy. It creates an invisible psychological weight, a heavy cognitive load, running silently in the background, like an app draining our mental battery. We are constantly calculating. We subconsciously wonder who is watching, how they will judge our lives, and whether this new post perfectly aligns with the digital character we have built. Over time, a subtle but dangerous gap begins to form. On one side is the person we actually are, messy, tired, and beautifully imperfect. On the other side is the digital avatar we are maintaining, polished, happy, and forever frozen in the best possible light. In neuroscience, sustaining two conflicting realities creates profound cognitive dissonance. In real life, we might be navigating burnout, grief, or deep loneliness, but online, our avatar is still effortlessly thriving. The wider this gap becomes, the more our nervous system begins to sound the alarm. Our nervous system is not interested in likes, views, or social currency. It is fiercely, exclusively designed to protect our internal stability and our survival. When it realizes that being visible requires us to constantly split our identity and bleed out our mental energy, it stops viewing external validation as a reward. Instead, the primitive, survival-driven parts of our brain start interpreting constant exposure as a literal threat. Our brain remembers the hidden sting of social comparison and the suffocating pressure of performing for an invisible audience. So it does exactly what a brilliant biological protector should do. It forcefully pulls the plug on the broadcast. That sudden heavy resistance we feel right before pressing share is not a sign of insecurity or emotional weakness. It is our nervous system stepping in, placing a firm hand on our chest and saying, "We do not have the energy to sustain this illusion today." It is a biological boundary being drawn to protect our authentic self from being entirely consumed by a digital world. And once we understand that our silence is actually an act of profound neurological self-defense, the entire meaning behind our desire to simply disappear begins to beautifully and radically transform. When we finally understand that our digital withdrawal is just our nervous system doing its job, the heavy shame begins to dissolve. We can stop looking at our digital silence as a sign that we are falling behind. Instead, we can recognize it as a highly intelligent biological boundary. It is our brain fiercely protecting our core identity from the exhausting demands of constant visibility. Understanding this hidden mechanism allows us to completely stop blaming ourselves. We can finally let go of the exhausting fear that something is fundamentally wrong with us. Because modern culture has quietly sold us a very dangerous illusion. It taught us that if a moment is not witnessed by others, it somehow loses its value. But perhaps the exact opposite is true. Maybe an undocumented life is not an empty life. Maybe it is the only kind of life that truly belongs to us. We can think of this shift as creating a private reserve. Every time we experience a quiet victory, a beautiful afternoon, or a moment of deep peace, we generate a very specific kind of internal emotional energy. When we immediately package that moment for an audience, we bleed that energy outward. We instinctively trade the raw depth of the experience for the fleeting, shallow reward of digital validation. But when we consciously choose to leave it unrecorded, that energy stays entirely within us. It nourishes our actual lives rather than feeding our digital avatars. We are no longer converting our lived reality into a consumable product. We are simply allowing ourselves to live it. There is a profound, almost rebellious freedom in choosing to remain unperceived. To deeply internalize that human beings do not owe the internet a constant update of their existence. We are allowed to heal in private. We are allowed to fail, to change, and to find absolute joy completely out of the public eye. Our absence online is not a symptom of insecurity, isolation, or a lack of confidence. It is the quiet, beautiful proof that our reality is rich enough without an audience. It means we have finally stopped proving that we exist and simply started existing. It makes us wonder how many of us are quietly navigating this exact same shift, slowly pulling our lives back from the digital stage. If this exploration sparked a realization about our shared human experience, or reminded you of a moment when you finally put the camera down, feel free to share those thoughts in the comments below. And if peeling back the hidden layers of the mind feels like a journey worth taking, consider subscribing to the channel. We have so much more to explore together.